my channel. I know it's been a little while. I will get onto your comments. I know I've been rather tardy in responding to your comments, but I will. I do intend on doing so. I haven't forgotten. I'll try and do another comments video at some point. But before I do that, I just wanted to plough on with some of Russell Barkley's lectures or commentaries, call it what you will, on this is specifically on ADHD, and the reason I normally talk about autism in my videos, but the reason why, but I feel this is relevant to autism as well. It's just that he talks about ADHD, but all of the things he talks about to do with ADHD, I feel are kind of can be generalised to autism and other conditions as well. So the one I wanted to talk to you about today, first of all, is what Russell Barkley has to say on the phenomenon of hyperfocus. Now, hyperfocus is often described as a positive entity, particularly in sort of like neurodiversity paradigm language, but it's actually far more complex than that. And it's not always positive. So this is what Russell Barkley has to say on hyperfocused in relation to ADHD, but as I say, this can also be talked about in relation to autism as well, because hyperfocus is something that can happen in both autism and ADHD. Okay, so first of all, he says, he asks a question: have people with ADHD been trained, okay, simply to report higher levels of quote-unquote hyperfocus, as the term is so often used in trade literature. In other words, overexposure to the term. And so in other words, this is kind of like a sort of positive, what do you call it, a feedback loop, almost, where people become overexposed to something, and they then start using that term to describe their own experience. So in a way, a kind of artificial overuse of a term in a way. And maybe I would also add myself that maybe this could also apply to things such as creativity and other so-called positive traits that are often used in conjunction with autism and ADHD. Russell Barkley also adds that the studies showing hyperfocus are also in those with high symptoms but no disorder. In other words, those with sort of subclinical traits. Also, the reports are subjective, not objective. Rating scales are what is usually used to measure hyperfocus, and rating scales being highly subjective, there are question marks here as to both their validity and their reliability. And then Russell Barkley mentions how hyperfocus is also related to internet addiction. So it's not that ADHD in and of itself is related to internet addiction, because phenomenon of hyperfocus can be related to internet addiction. So that's what he has to say about hyperfocus. Oh yes, and there's a bit more here. Yeah, he talks about ADHD being not an attention disorder, but really a disorder of self-regulation, which requires 7 executive functions. And that external momentary events guide their behaviour. Normally, there is a shift from external information to mental or private or internal, as the person matures. So mental, this would involve things such as working memory, about what we should be doing, goals guiding us to our... mental, this should involve things such as working memory about what we should be doing. So either guiding us to our goals, or if someone has poor working memory, might be captured by everything going on around us in the now. And also, as you get older, as you're transitioning from a need to be controlled by others to more self-regulation, and also a shift from the temporal now to looking ahead and responsibilities over time. So there's a shift from being rewarded by immediate events to delayed gratification. And he talked about ADHD and being time or future blind. So hyperfocusing may reflect the guidance of behaviour by the moment. Hyperfocus, he says, is great so long as you are not competing with things that you should have been doing. So long as it's not competing with things that you should have been doing. So it's bad if it competes with more productive activities, leading to addiction. And he also talks about a compulsive need to go back to an activity, quick impulsive emotions, and a need to be busy. So that's where he talks about how hyperfocus, certainly in relation to ADHD, and some of this will indeed also be relevant to autism, as ADHD and autism do heavily overlap anyway. So is hyperfocus really a positive all the time? Yeah. So again, the next thing that Berkeley talks about in relation to ADHD, but also, as I said, it can also be talked about in relation to autism as well, is creativity. Because one of the stereotypes that's often bandied about is how people with ADHD and people with autism and other neuro disorders are super creative. Well, are they really? So it all depends really on what you mean by creativity. So first of all, there's one idea of creativity is how many novel ideas can you come up with that are useful. So this would mean just coming up with a variety of ideas, because just coming up with a variety of ideas on its own could mean you have a thought disorder, for example psychosis. So in order to be creative, the key thing is how many novel ideas can you come up with that are useful. Ideas need to be put to use. It's no good just having loads and loads of ideas if you can't put them to use. And that obviously involves executive functioning, of course. There are, of course, different types of creativity, one of which is divergent creativity, and that's coming up with a diversity of ideas. For example, how many things can you do with a brick? That's an example of divergent creativity. And the next type of creativity is called convergent. And this is where you have a specific problem that needs to be solved, and creativity is in the service of a goal. That involves executive functioning. So, as Russell Berkeley says, people with ADHD are expected to struggle with convergent creativity because it involves executive functioning, which is the core deficit in ADHD. So, when ADHD is defined as a clinical disorder, no higher weights in creativity are found. But if you use weighting scales of symptoms, and especially if a person has a high IQ, then there was a correlation. So there is a correlation, I'll say it again, there's a correlation if you use rating scales of symptoms along with high IQ, but not at the point of disorder. So not clinical ADHD, only when there's high symptoms, which is not the same thing as having a disorder. That's not, if you've just got high symptoms, you're not going to get a diagnosis. You don't have the disorder. The studies have varied in tests used and how they assessed ADHD and intelligence. So, yeah, different studies. Studies varied in the tests used. Healy and Rockledge 2008 review, Guildford Journals, compared 33 diagnosed ADHD people to 34 controls, aged 10 to 12, and they were compared in a variety of measures of creativity, and no difference was found between the controls and the ADHD group. And some of the kids in the past studies may have been on medication. But it was thought that this might lower the creativity if on medication, so that's to bear in mind. He says that disinhibition is a symptom cited that's most often linked to creativity and impulsivity. So less cognitive inhibition might result in greater divergent creativity. But in 2016 there was a meta-analysis, Payek et al. Gifted Child Quarterly Journal. I was looking at links between 3 forms of psychopathology and indicators of creativity. So this was looking at small creativity as specific tasks, small c creativity I should say, as specific tasks. Not broader creativity, art, etc. It wasn't looking at broader creativity, it's just looking at specific tasks. Because as I say, it really just depended on how you define creativity. And this was psychometric tasks. They looked at 89 studies, they looked at as many studies as possible. They looked at ADHD, they looked at anxiety, they looked at depression, all sorts of psychopathology. They found no relationship between the psychopathology and weight of creative thinking. So, yes, and there's a need to control also for intelligence, age, gender, and diagnosis versus weighting scales, because all of that, alongside how you define creativity, will of course influence what you find. In 2020, Hugeman et al. Did a meta-analysis and review. Science Direct, that's neuroscience and biobehavioural reviews, and they focused exclusively on ADHD and at how it's measured, so weightings versus diagnosis. They looked at the effect of medication, they looked at measures of divergent creativity and convergent. They reviewed 31 studies, and most studies find evidence for increased divergent thinking for those with high ADHD scores, but nonetheless who are subclinical, but not for those with the disorder, only for those with subclinical presentation. Both samples claim to have more creative abilities, but this can't be confirmed because it was self-report. And often there's a positive illusory bias where an individual reports themselves behaving better, doing better than other people would actually say about them. And also, medication is shown to have absolutely no effect on creativity. And high IQ was related to being more creative. Well, that's no surprise because that's been found before. That high IQ, there's a strong correlation between high IQ and creativity. And also, the few studies that do show a link between ADHD and creativity have problems. First of all, they are college students with ADHD. College students, they're going to have more cultural enrichment, they're going to be exposed to more creativity, so you expect them to be more creative, right? College students, because it's not representative. And also, number 2, they just had elevated symptoms. They did not have a disorder. They were not diagnosable, just elevated symptoms. And 3, they are incredibly bright, which in and of itself makes you more likely to be creative. So, middle class, cultural enrichment, these are all confounds. These are obviously going to influence the extent to which someone is creative. So incredibly biased, and the article also cherry-picked studies. So it wasn't scholarly. It only mentioned studies that found a relationship. And this was, by the way, Abraham 2014, Review of Creativity and Psychopathology, the concept of an inverted U, Frontiers 2014. So this found that in normal quote-unquote people, there's typical creativity. As symptoms increase, of ADHD that is, the person becomes more impulsive. This is associative in thinking, free range, defocused, or unfocused, you see an increase in creativity. But when the symptoms enter the pathological range, creativity declines to typical. And if it's more serious, you end up with lower levels of creativity, you end up with impaired creativity. So this is known as the inverted U. So I say again, normal people, typical creativity, typical, so a normal bell curve. As symptoms of psychopathology increase, the person becomes more impulsive, associative in thinking, free range, defocused or unfocused thinking. You see an increase in creativity. Symptoms increase. They do not have a disorder. They just have a higher level of these symptoms. That's not the same thing as disorder. When a symptom enters a pathological range, creativity declines back down to typical. So in other words, they just have a typical level of creativity, nothing spectacular, just the same as normal people. But if it's more serious, the person has a, more severe presentation, you see an impaired creativity, which kind of stands to reason, really. So this debunks the whole idea of ADHD is linked to creativity. Right, now I'm going to move on to the next video where he talks about ADHD's relationship to entrepreneurship. So now moving on to the next video.